Okay, so today is the last class in what we've called our Himalayan journey. And today we're going to be traveling to Tibet. I will try and leave the images up a little longer than I have in the past. I've had a couple of comments that maybe I don't get enough time to look at some of these images, some of which are quite stunning. But so Tibet is a region in East Asia. You can see it on the map here, covering much of what is known as the Tibetan Plateau. On the map, it's in yellow. It spans 970,000 square miles. To the right there, you see images of the Tibetan people, and this is their homeland. You can probably see what we call the Mongolian influence in the faces. This is one ethnic group. There are several others. There's also quite a number of Han Chinese who also live in Tibet. It's the highest region on Earth, average elevation of 14,000 feet. When I was in, like I said, when I was in Nepal, we got up to about 14,000 feet. And being outside for about 15 to 20 minutes, if you're not used to that, started to feel lightheaded. So the average is 14,000 feet. It's bounded on the north, if you can, and the east, by what is called the Central China Plain. On the west by Kashmir, which of course is part of India. And then on the south, you can see below the Himalayas, Nepal, Bhutan.
Well, I don't see what more we could do.
Nedra, I think you have to mute. Can you mute?
Yes, she's muted now. It's
Okay.
just her video's on.
Okay, well, that's okay. I think we're all right for the moment. Most of Tibet is known structurally as the Tibetan Plateau. And here you can see two images of it. One on the right is a satellite image. You can see this large plateau which sits north of the Himalayas. And speaking of the Himalayas, on the border of Nepal and Tibet is Mount Everest. Actually, both Nepal and Tibet tend to claim it. So I think the border runs actually just across part of the ridge.
Excuse me, Bill. Do you want to mention why you pronounce it Himalayas rather than Himalayas?
I think I did way back at Nepal, but yeah, Himalaya is the Sanskrit name. Him means ice, Alaya means place. So it's the Himalaya. The reason you get Himalaya, the British, when they were in India, anglicized many of the names of places, many of the cities, for example. Mumbai, which it is the British call Bombay. And so you'll just get a lot of that. I just tend to go by the Sanskrit name when I can. So him means ice, Alaya means place. So a library in Sanskrit is pustakalaya. Pustak is book, Alaya is place. So I refer to them as the Himalayas, but you will generally hear in the English-speaking world Himalayas. So physically, Tibet can be divided into two main parts, what are known as the lake region in the west and northwest, and the river region, which spreads out on three sides on the east, south, and west. So this is the lake region. Like I say, it extends west and north from Ladakh. On the map, can you see Ladakh? Ladakh is in Kashmir, but the lake region starts there and then spreads up into parts of Tibet. And you can see two images on the left, one a satellite image, one just a picture of one of these lakes. It's arid, it's windswept. It is called by the Tibetans the Northern Plateau. It's some 700 miles broad and covers an area equal to that about the country of France. Due to the extremely high mountain barriers, it has a very arid alpine climate. It gets extremely cold, very little precipitation, only about 4 inches per year. And there are no river outlets. It is dotted with small lakes. Here's an example of 2 of the lakes, the Pangangso and the Yamdrok. Interestingly enough, it's also known for its hot springs. And a number of tourists come up to this area to partake in these hot springs. It's interesting. It's so cold, though, that these springs often, as the water comes up, turned into columns of ice. The river region stretches east and north from the city of Lhasa. We'll be visiting Lhasa in quite a bit. But you see Lhasa, it's the red dot on the map. That's the capital. So the river region spreads to the north and to the east of Lhasa. It is characterized by numerous fertile mountain valleys, which include the Yarlung-Zhongpo Canyon, formed by a horseshoe bend in the river. You can see this picture of it taken from above. It's the deepest and possibly longest canyon in the world. You can get a sense from this picture on the left how it is approximately 800 miles long and 200 miles wide. The valley descends from 15,000 feet to 9,000 feet. So that's a 6,000-foot drop. That would be like starting in 1,000 feet above Denver and coming to Camarillo. So it's a pretty steep drop and very scenic. It's bounded by the Himalayas, and it has a couple of main lakes. This is Lake Paiku. Rainfall is about 4 to 5 inches per year. It actually, during the summer, can get up to the mid-70s in temperature. In the winter, it's anywhere from freezing to about 45. So those are the 2 main regions, one stretching north and west, the other north and east, the lake region and the river region. And at the border of the river region, again, are the Himalayas. So Lhasa is the capital. You can see it here on the map in a sort of a picture on the right. It's the main urban center and the administrative capital of what is now the Tibet Autonomous Region. It's called the Tibet Autonomous Region of China, which was formally established in 1965 after the Chinese annexation of Tibet. And we're going to get into that in terms of its history.
Us
China-
muting or unmuting, not him.
I heard someone's mic is on.
Yeah, they're muted now.
Okay. Yes, like I said, when I cover the history, we'll get into how this took place. But so when I speak of, if I was speaking of Tibet today, to some people, they'd want to make sure that I said that it was part of China. To others, of course, it's really an independent country that should be independent, et cetera, et cetera. But we'll get into that in just a moment. So Lhasa has been actually the religious and administrative capital of Tibet since the mid-17th century. It contains many culturally significant Buddhist sites, which we will be visiting shortly. At an altitude of just under 12,000 feet, it is one of the highest cities in the world. Its population is just under 500,000. There is one other city worth mentioning, and that is the city of Shagaste. You can see where it is located here, near the Himalayas. It's actually the gateway to Everest. So if many tourists will come through Shagaste if they're going up to the base camps near Everest on the border of Nepal. It's located 170 miles southwest of Lhasa, and is very well known for this monastery on the right, known as the Tashil Umpo Monastery. It's located on a hill in the center of the city. The full name in Tibetan means all fortune and happiness gathered here. All fortune and happiness gathered here. We actually have an account written by one Captain Samuel Turner, a British officer of the East India Company, who visited this monastery back in the 18th century. He described it in the following terms. If the magnificence of the place was to be increased by any external cause, none could more superbly have adorned its numerous gilded canopies and turrets than the sun rising in full splendor directly opposite. It presented a view wonderfully beautiful and brilliant. The effect was little short of magic, and it made an impression which no time will ever efface from my mind. So let's look at a little bit of the history of Tibet. The history of a unified Tibet begins with the rule of Songtsen Gampo, 604 to 650. You may remember, referring both in Nepal and Tibet, that this was the gentleman who united the great Tibetan Empire, which included for a time both Nepal and Bhutan. He brought in many reforms, united the country, and his power spread very quickly. He enlarged the empire and included it to include parts of what are Afghanistan today, Bhutan, as I said, Bhutan, Nepal, parts of northern India. Tradition says that his first wife, that's on the right of this image, was a Nepalese princess, and that she played a great role in the establishment of Buddhism in Tibet. Apparently, according to the tradition, she was the one who introduced the emperor to Buddhism. In 640, he married another princess, Wen Cheng, that's on the left. She was the niece of the Chinese emperor Taizong of the Tang China dynasty. And here we see the image of the two ladies, his two queens, one on the left and one on the right. So under the next few kings, Buddhism became established as the state religion. We're going to talk a bit more about that later. And Tibetan power increased over, like I said, areas of Central Asia, all the way down to the borders of what is today India. Major inroads were also made into what is today Chinese territory, at one point even reaching the Tang capital of Chanang, which is today known as Xi'an, in 763. Some of you might have been to Xi'an. That's where you get the soldier, the statues of the soldier army. That was the capital of the Tang Dynasty. And at one point, the Tibetan Empire spread that far into China, but didn't last too long. The Tang finally repulsed and drove the Tibetans back. At its height, and that's about in the late 8th century, the Tibetan Empire, like I said, spread from all the way from Central Asia to all the way of what is today the borders of Bangladesh. In 821, Tibet and China signed a peace treaty, whereby Tibet continued as a Central Asian empire until the mid-9th century, when a civil war over succession led to the collapse of Imperial Tibet. This is a common theme in these empires. There'll be someone who unifies them. They will remain a unified empire for a century or two. Then as that power decreases, there will be power struggles within, and you'll get fragmentation. And this period is known as the era of fragmentation. Now, if you see on the map all these names in black here that surround, those are all the different power dynasties that were struggling to have their influence most felt in Tibet. And it's a period of breakdown, very common. You'll have unification, you'll have breakdown. Somewhere along the line, you'll have reunification. In terms of Tibet, that happened in the 13th century, not as a result of any one of these princely areas unifying Tibet, but the Chinese. Now, it's important to realize the deep connection China and Tibet have had over the centuries. That helps explain a little better what happened in the 1950s and the two different points of view. So from the 13th century, the Mongol Yuan dynasty, I think we mentioned this last time when we were talking about Bhutan. This was one of the Khanates, one of the sub-dynasties of the great Mongol Empire initiated by Genghis Khan, which ruled China for a couple centuries and actually then unified Tibet again in the 13th century. And they retained nominal power politically, but they allowed religious power, if we can put it that way, to remain in the hands of local Tibetans. And that's important. There's this sort of division, as far as the Chinese see it, between political control and religious control. So for our purposes, the next really important date is 1578, when the Chinese ruler, Altan Khan, the Mongol named Khan, gave to Sonam Gyatso, leader of the Gelugpa school of Buddhism, the title Dalai Lama. Dalai being the Mongolian translation of the Tibetan name Gyatso, meaning ocean. So this was the establishment of the institution of the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama was the head of one of the major schools of Buddhism, the Gelugpa, and we'll be looking at that again shortly.
Bill?
Yes.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they allow that? I mean, why was that advantageous to the Yuan Khanate to allow that kind of division of power? Why did they do that?
I think because they realized that if they didn't, they would have a lot more political unrest. So it was, you allow the Dalai Lamas to control things religiously, and even to some degree a little bit politically, as long as you don't challenge the Yuan power. if you go in and try and change people's religious views, it usually causes you more trouble than it's worth. So that would be my understanding. This was Tibetan Buddhism had been around for quite a while. There were a number of schools, so they decided that this one school should be given predominance, and they gave this gentleman the title of Dalai Lama, and then that way they could actually have a better hand on political control.
Got it. That makes sense.
But that will break down, as we will see.
Yeah.
So this is Sonam Gyatso, and and this starts the series of Dalai Lamas. The fifth Dalai Lama, Nawang Losang Gyatso, 1617 to 1682, is known for unifying the Tibetan heartland under the school of Gelug. There still are numerous Buddhist schools up until the 50s in Tibet. This became the most predominant, and he unifies most of Tibet religiously under his leadership. The last Chinese, so we're now going to move forward to the Qing dynasty, because politically, all this time, China or whatever Chinese empire is intact. They're the Ming after the Yuan, and then the Qing. They keep political eyes on Tibet. They make sure things are not going against their own needs. And this is the last Chinese dynasty. It lasts from 1636 to 1912. This was, if you've ever seen any of the history of this period, this was when the Chinese Civil War breaks out. This will be the last imperial dynasty. Now, it's during this time, during the Qing rule, that there's a British expeditionary force that goes into Tibet. This is a marvelous old photograph here. You can see one of the monasteries here in Lhasa and all the British tents set up here. This is the British Expeditionary Force under a man by the name of Sir Francis Younghusband. They had invaded Tibet for the fear that Russia might extend its power into Tibet. During this time, the late 19th century, early to late 19th century, there's something called the Great Game. Rudyard Kipling refers to this. And this was British fears that Russia was going to come down into India. And one way you could protect that from happening would be to control the areas north of India, one of those being Tibet. So this expeditionary force goes in, sets up its tents. And what's interesting is that the Dalai Lama actually flees. So we have earlier examples of the Dalai Lama fleeing. This time he's fleeing for fear of the British because they capture Lhasa. So they want, what the British want, they want good relations with the Qing dynasty in China. So they make an agreement, and that agreement says the British will not annex any part of Tibet in return for a certain indemnity from the Chinese government, while China agreed not to permit any other foreign state to interfere in this territory. And as far as the British were concerned, that would be Russia. So that's why we have this British expeditionary force going into Tibet at this time. In 1910, and this isn't long before the Qing dynasty collapses, the Qing actually will send a military expedition of its own to depose the Dalai Lama, who then flees to British India. So it's important to realize that the fleeing of the Dalai Lama, everyone knows about it in the 1950s, but this had happened a couple times before, because Tibet seems to get caught because of its location in between imperial powers. So in 1911, there's a a revolution in China. The first stages in the Qing dynasty collapses. This is before the communists take over. Before that, there's what is known as the Republic of China. They apologize for the Qing invasion and bring the Dalai Lama back and allow him to exist, as long as he will recognize Chinese sovereignty. The Dalai Lama, however, refuses to take a Chinese title and declares himself ruler of an independent Tibet. So it's during this period of chaos in China where the Qing dynasty has collapsed. There's a revolution going on, which will then lead to a larger civil war between the Republic of China and Mao's forces. It's during this time that the Dalai Lama refuses to be underneath Chinese authority and claims to be an independent ruler and Tibet to be an independent country. Remember that, it's important. So for the next 36 years, the 13th Dalai Lama, whose name is Thubten Gyatso, and here we see a picture of him, and his regents who succeeded him govern Tibet. Although in China, there are continual rumblings that Tibet actually belongs to them. And they have some historical precedents for saying that. For example, on December 20th, 1941, the Kuomintang leader, and he was for a short period, this is the gentleman who will be fighting Mao's forces for control of China. It's known as the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek noted in his diary that Tibet would be one of the territories, the first territories he would demand as a restitution for China following the conclusion of World War II. So from early on, China still maintains that Tibet is part of China. Similarly, as it will with Hong Kong, and then later with Taiwan, they see this as legitimately, historically part of China. Of course, then we have the victory of Mao's forces in China, known as the People's Republic of China. I'll just refer to that as the PRC from now on. They claim openly that Tibet is part of China. Furthermore, they proclaim what they call an ideological, sociological motivation to liberate the Tibetans from the theocratic, feudal rule of the lamas. Just one second here. Spam risk. I keep getting spam risk. In any case, so once Mao has consolidated, he has his eyes on Tibet. Of course, at this point, Tibet has been ruled independently by the lamas for over 36 years. So in December of 1949, talks between Tibet and China took place about the situation, and mediated by the British and the Indian governments. But while they're talking, China had other plans. And on October 7th, 1950, Chinese troops advanced into eastern Tibet, crossing the border at 5 different places. Tibet, in the meantime, failed to secure any real foreign support or assistance, and the negotiations fell apart. I think one can perhaps understand internationally why. A number of countries didn't want to get involved with a conflict with China. So the Tibetans really do not have any real political support. They may have verbal support, but no real political support. Tibetan negotiators then go to Beijing I say negotiators, but they're more or less summoned to Beijing and presented with an already finished document, commonly referred to as the 17-point agreement. There was no negotiation offered by the Chinese. Religious freedom was guaranteed. Tibet would have to agree to be part of China, not an independent state. The Tibetan negotiators were not allowed to communicate with their own government and were pressured into signing the agreement, despite not having been given permission by the Tibetan government to do so. Shortly afterwards, the People's Liberation Army entered Lhasa. This is the army of the communist regime. Now, for several years, the Tibetan government maintained some degree of autonomy from the Chinese central government and was allowed to maintain its traditional structure. But behind the scene, we now know who's really in power. In 1956, militias, now this is important, local Tibetan militias infiltrated to some degree by Chinese who've been brought in to Tibet during this interim period. They began to fight against the Tibetan government troops. Now, the Tibet did not have much of an army. So they come in March of 1959. At this point, the Dalai Lama decides to leave. And the story is he, in disguise, he leaves at night with some of his close followers, and his destination is northern India, the city of Dharamsala. He subsequently repudiated the 17-point agreement, and the PRC dissolved the Tibetan government absolutely. And the legacy of that period remains until
Hi, Joan.
I
That's
wanna-
Bev. Bev is not muted.
Bev's on, okay. Somebody's phone, somebody's needs to be muted.
Very,
Bev,
very good. That's fine. Bye-bye, love.
Okay, I want to just stop just for a moment here because I want to mention my friend Dr. Barry Curzon. Speaking of Dharamsala, a little bit of a side story, but I think a good one. And here you see a photograph of Barry with the Dalai Lama. Barry is a Buddhist monk, initiated into the Gelug practice, but his background was that he was a doctor in Ventura County. He actually had a practice in Ojai. He was raised in North Hollywood, or Hollywood, I think West Hollywood, and went to USC Medical School, became a doctor, practiced in Ojai, and then was involved at the University of Washington for a number of years, where he came in contact with meditation and started to think about meditation being incorporated into his medical practice. And then he had a great tragedy in his life. His wife died of cervical cancer at a young age. He was quite shaken by that. He decided to go to India. He was on a spiritual search. And he spent a number of years in India looking at going to various ashrams and gurus, and ended up going into Dharamsala, eventually got an interview with the Dalai Lama. Was taken by what he saw in the Dalai Lama's teachings, and decided he wanted to become a monk. So he asked the Dalai Lama if he could be initiated, and the Dalai Lama said, go to silent retreat for 3 years, come back. If you still want to be a monk, okay. So Barry went to a silent retreat center in France, where he was basically in silent retreat for 3 years. There was a little bit of communication, but by and large, it's mainly silence and meditation. He came back. He is now one of the Dalai Lama's medical doctors. He travels with the Dalai Lama around the world. He's often in Southern California. He tends to come back once a year. I think some of you may have met him. He spoke at the church once. When you're around Barry, you get the peace, the sense of peace. That's all I can say. There's something about him. It may be the fact that he's meditated for over 30,000 hours or whatever it is. He also took part in the University of Wisconsin study of having his brain scanned along with another French monk to see if the impact of meditation. And there are definitely signs that they can read in the brain that this does have its impact. So I just wanted to mention very quickly. Okay, so as in Bhutan, the form of Buddhism that is prevalent in Tibet, and it still is to some degree, much more so during when the Dalai Lama was there, is known as Vajrayana Buddhism, or the Thunderbolt. I think I mentioned the Thunderbolt or the diamond vehicle because the diamond cuts everything. And as last week we saw that there are a number of elements to this form of Buddhism. It includes not only the Four Noble Truths, etc., but the use of these three aspects. Do you remember these? The mantra, the mudra, and the mandala. And they're used as means of trying to break through the intellectual approach to understanding Buddhism and get an immediate impact. So, for example, the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, visualizing the hand mudra of fearlessness, etc., plus visualization of the various bodhisattvas and spirits. So this is the core of Vajrayana Buddhism. It also includes something that are known as the, sometimes say, the 6 perfections or the 10 perfections. They are wisdom, patience, truthfulness and honesty, goodwill, loving kindness, equanimity, serenity. And if you've ever heard the Dalai Lama speak, these are the sorts of things he focuses on. He's and I'll have a bit more to say about the Dalai Lama momentarily. So I think I mentioned before that the dominant school is known as the Gelug, or the yellow hats, because that's the traditional yellow hat that they wear. Spiritual head is the Dalai Lama, and the order was founded in the 14th or 15th centuries. And there have been successive Dalai Lamas ruling since the 17th. So let me just say a few words about the current or 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso. Born July 6, 1935, on a straw mat in a cowshed, sound familiar, to a farmer's family in a remote part of Tibet. After a selection process, and I'll say something about that in just a second, on February 5th, 1940, he became the 14th Dalai Lama. After his exile from Tibet, he took the message of Tibetan Buddhism to the world at large. Before Tenzin Gyatso, very few people knew anything about Tibetan Buddhism. And he has interestingly said, and this is so much part of his worldview, that what appears at one point to be a tragedy can often turn out to be one of the best things that can happen to you. The tragedy, of course, being banished from his homeland of Tibet, having to leave and to go to Dharamsala. But what that also did was open up the world to his message. So much so that by 2013, he was known as one of the 2 most popular world leaders. You know who he was tied with at the time? Barack Obama. In any case, so let me just say a little bit about this selection process because it's kind of fascinating. When a Dalai Lama dies, there's a process of trying to find his reincarnation. because the next Dalai Lama is believed to be a reincarnation of the past Dalai Lama. The first thing that is done is the leading lamas, and that term is used for the hierarchy of, so there's the Dalai Lama, and under him are a variety of different lamas. This, what is called the Nechung Oracle, is consulted. Now, the Nechung Oracle is an individual. You can see examples of two of these oracles, who are believed to somehow be spiritual mediums. And so they somehow have spiritual knowledge as to at least the direction people should go, or the next lama should go, leading lama should go to try and find the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. Other high lamas may have had visions in a dream. Sometimes it's said when the last Dalai Lama is cremated, that the smoke of that creation, the way that travels, may point the direction. In any case, leading lamas are sent out, and a number of child candidates are selected. And then they are given previous articles that the former Dalai Lama had, and they're observed. According to what Barry has told me about the current Dalai Lama, when he was given, and I forget what the exact object, I think it was some beads. I think he was given some beads of the last Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama. He was only 2, and they put them around his neck. Or maybe he could just barely talk, 2 or 3. And then when they tried to take the beads away, he wouldn't give them back. And he kept clinging them to him and saying something effective, mine, mine, mine. Well, that seemed to be some indication that perhaps he was the right guy. To many people, this seems superstitious. I must admit, it does to me. But again, it's a worldview, and it's part of a tradition that has gone on for centuries. And so the 14th Dalai Lama was chosen. And then once that happened, he and his family are taken to Lhasa, and they're taken to this monastery, the Dripung Monastery, and we'll see this again a bit later. And this is where he will be educated. He is educated in philosophy, Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. He was also had a science background. In fact, when we went and heard the Dalai Lama speak down in Universal City, I think years ago, someone asked him a question, and he said, "I am a scientist." So from a young age, he had a telescope. So in any case, he's a very well-educated individual. The Dalai Lamas know their Tibetan Buddhism because they are educated for years and years and years. One other thing I want to say about Tibetan Buddhism, there was a religious tradition, an indigenous tradition known as Bon, B-O-N, pre-Buddhist. Much of this has been absorbed into the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And much of it involves the worship of spirits. And many of these spirits, as you can see, are not necessarily friendly. And so they're incorporated into the Buddhist Vajrayana worldview, and they're generally seen as your demons, which can be transformed into your angels. We all have our demons. Rather than trying to repress our demon, if you want to look at this in perhaps a Western psychological point of view, rather than trying to repress your demons, which just get deeper and more poisonous, you learn to incorporate them into your psyche through various rituals, etc. So it's sort of a melding of certain animistic spirits into the Tibetan Buddhist scheme. Okay, I know we're getting onto 4 o'clock. I want to look at some of the wonderful sites. Most of these are in Lhasa. First, we have here the Potala Palace. This was the winter palace of the Dalai Lamas from 1649 to 1959 and is now a museum. The Chinese have turned most of these into museums and is a World Heritage Site. It's named after Mount Potalaka. This is a mythical mountain. And this is believed to be the home of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who is the famous Bodhisattva of compassion. Female form is Kuan Yin. It was built starting in 1645 by the 5th Dalai Lama, and it sits atop what is known as Red Hill. The building measures 1,300 feet east to west and 1,150 feet north to south, sloping 10-foot thick stone walls with copper poured into the foundations to help proof it against earthquakes. 13 stories, 1,000 rooms, 10,000 shrines, 200,000 statues. Needless to say, you can spend an entire day here. The Jokang Temple and Monastery is considered the spiritual heart of Lhasa and the most sacred monastery in Tibet. It's located about 1,000 yards southeast of the palace. It's the oldest temple in Lhasa, with a history of more than 1,300 years. Now, of course, it's been renovated a number of times. Estimated dates for beginning of its building, 639 to 647.
Wow.
I'll leave this up just for a moment so you can get a good view. Notice the deer, which are very prevalent in Buddhism, mainly because of something that was known as Deer Park in India, where the Buddha first went. And if you go there today, there's still a deer park. There's a deer park in outside of Nara, Japan, and in the center, the famed Buddhist wheel. This was said to be established when Buddha gave his first sermon. It's called the Sermon of the Turning of the Wheel of the Law. Now, what makes this monastery very famous is this statue known as the Jowo Mikyo Dorje. It was said to have been brought to Tibet as part of the dowry. Do you remember when we mentioned the Nepali princess who brought Buddhism perhaps to Tibet? She, according to legend, also brought with her as part of her dowry this famous statue known as the Jowo Mikyo Dorje, and it's located inside this temple. It's been there ever since. It is the most revered statue in all of Tibet. A short distance away, and this isn't as elaborate, but I thought I'd include it, is the Anai Tsonghung Nunnery. The word Ani means nun, and Sanghung means a place for spiritual retreat. It was built in the 7th century, again by that famous emperor Songtsen Gampo, initially as a meditation chamber for himself and his retinue. But since the 12th century, it has been used chiefly by Buddhist nuns. The youngest nuns are 16. Younger nuns live on the ground floor. The older nuns live upstairs. They're dependent on alms, given in return for their prayers. They also make handicrafts, which they sell, and run an inexpensive outdoor restaurant serving noodles and dumplings. Then there's the Norbolinka Palace, literally jeweled park. It's a palace and surrounding in Lhasa, built in 1755 by the 7th Dalai Lama, which served as both an administrative and religious center. It was also the summer residence of successive Dalai Lamas, built and of the last and of the 14th Dalai Lama. Now, let me just give a little bit of perspective here from the Chinese government. The lavishness of these structures, the wealth that was put into them, is sometimes considered to be an example of the exploitation of the Tibetan people. I want to just give you that perspective, because it's always important to realize both sides of any position, and that they see themselves as liberating the Tibetan people from this medieval religious structure. This palace is a World Heritage Site. It's a museum. Here's some of the interior. And it's also surrounded by beautiful gardens. It's a hub of entertainment and various festivals. For example, every year there is the Sholdun Festival, commonly called the Yogurt Festival. It's celebrated in the summer, usually in mid-August. After it celebrates, just before this, the monks retreat. The monks go into a 3-month retreat where they stay within their monasteries. One of the reasons to avoid walking on summer insects and thus killing them. So after this 3 months of in the monasteries, they come out and there's a great festival. And this festival began in the 11th century. It's called the Yogurt Festival because the lay people gave the monks yogurt to eat. It's now often the site of operas and a large number of festivals. 2 other important sites that are actually outside of Lhasa. We saw this site earlier, the Drepung Monastery. This is where the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, was educated. It's known as the Rice Heap Monastery. It's located on this mountain 3 miles from Lhasa. It's the largest of all the Tibetan monasteries, and it was founded in 1416. You can see the view you can get of Lhasa on the right. This monastery was known for its very high academic standards. It was actually called the Nalanda of Tibet. And this was a reference to a great medieval Buddhist monastic university in India known as Nalanda, where all the great monks of northern India were educated. So this has been called the Nalanda of Tibet. And like we said, this is where Tenzin Gyatso was educated. Notice on the right, always prayer wheels. This picture here would no doubt be of one of the Dalai Lamas. And finally, there is a place called Drek Yerpa. It's located about 20 miles northeast of Lhasa, a large complex, as you can see, of temples, monasteries, and meditation caves nested on the mountain. Who founded it? You guessed. King Songtsen Gampo, for his queens and himself, where they would come to meditate. different Buddhist sects and even some Buddhist from different countries have established monasteries here. Like I said, there are numerous caves with frescoes and statues, all designed for the purpose of deep meditation. And I think there are 12 to 14 caves that are now you can visit if you go there. They all have their separate names, like the Moon Cave and the Shining Pond Cave, etc. Okay, I want to conclude with just a few quotes from the Dalai Lama. So let's look at these. First, on the left. The planet does not need more successful people. The planet desperately needs more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of all kind. Then on the right, there are only 2 days that nothing, can you read that, Chris? Because it doesn't come up on mine.
Yeah, it says there are only 2 days in the year that nothing can be done. One is called yesterday and the other is called tomorrow. Today is the night day to love. Believe, do, and mostly live.
This is the notion that he's always preaching. It's always now. Be here now. Be mindful of now. The past is gone. The future isn't here. Anxiety comes from thinking too much about either one of those. Be here now. This is when you can do something. Okay, why don't you just continue reading them? Could you, Chris?
Sure. I think when tragic things happen, it is on the surface. It's like the ocean. On the surface, a wave comes, and sometimes the wave is very serious and strong. But it comes and goes, comes and goes. And underneath, the ocean always remains calm. I like that a lot. And Thich Nhat Hanh also gives the analogy of the wave and the ocean, that we are all waves, but underneath, we all have the depthness of the ocean. And I believe that the only true religion consists of having a good heart.
And this is from a man who is so steeped in philosophical fineries of Buddhist thought. And what does he conclude? It's a matter of having a good heart. Okay.
People exist to be loved. Objects exist to be used. The world is in chaos because these things are the other way around.
And finally,
if you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping with a mosquito.
okay, so that brings us to the end of our journey. Let me see if I can pull my screen down here. And we can open up to any thoughts, questions, just about anything. So,
This is Jerry Olson.
Hi, Jerry.
Did you run into any kind of problems with the Chinese while you were touring Tibet?
I have not been to Tibet. The closest we got was when we went to China. We were considering going to Tibet, but doctors advised for various reasons that the elevation would be problematic. So, but from what I know, when you go to Tibet these days, you have to go through the Chinese, you have to go through China. You can't just go into Tibet, and you will be part of a tour. You don't just wander around on your own. You will be led by an official tour guide who is likely to give you more of the official Chinese version of things. And yeah, part of our group did go to Tibet and then flew back down and met us on the boat. And they said that it was quite nice and friendly, but you were pretty well guided, if I can use that term.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bill?
Yeah. Who's that? Just
Well, this is Helen. I just want to know, with the future Dalai Lama, where how are they educating the future Dalai Lama since they've been exiled from Tibet?
Well, first of all, you don't educate a future Dalai Lama. You got to find him.
Okay.
What's interesting is that apparently the Chinese have someone lined up.
Oh, interesting. Our daughter-in-law and son, of course, went to Tibet when they were living in Beijing. So
Okay.
they-
What the Dalai Lama has said is he may be the last.
that's what I wondered. If
It's going to be
Yeah.
very interesting. I spoke to Barry just a month or so ago, asked him how the Dalai Lama's health was. He said he's in very good health.
Mhm.
And so for the moment, but this is a question which remains on everybody's mind. It may well be that this is the last Tibetan Dalai Lama, and the future Dalai Lama will be someone who's chosen by the Chinese.
Right.
What that will do to the Tibetan community remains to be seen.
Yeah.
In the traditional process of seeking the Dalai Lama, have there been those that came to the monastery, they were chosen, who have left or who were unfit? Or once you're there, that's it?
It's a pretty rigorous process. They're taken very young and they are educated. And as far as I know, and I don't know the details of all this history. I don't know of that being the case. But if there were to be a problem, there would be a way of getting around it. They would find a method but all religions do this.
Yeah.
All religions have to have answers to that which is unanswerable. But I don't know that has actually happened. But I'll try and find out. I'll ask Barry next time I see him. He would probably.
It just seems that even though you take them very young and put them in an environment that would give them every opportunity to buy in and to absorb, that there are some individuals who just don't.
Well, let me say this. He's surrounded by a lot of other people. He's surrounded by a lot of other lamas. So just like kings in Europe, if the king wasn't really up to it, he often had advisors. And he would become the spokesperson for those advisors. The current Dalai Lama is just a very brilliant guy. And also, if you've ever seen him, very humorous. He's got a great sense of humor and very open to spreading his understanding of Buddhism to the West. And he understands that there have to be some adaptations made to the Buddhist message from the traditional message that he was educated in. And he's been able to do that. Anyone else? Any thoughts, comments?
What did Tibet receive in return for China absorbing them? Did they receive
Nothing.
nothing?
Again,
It's
what
like Taiwan.
what the Chinese have tried to do is they have enlisted the peasantry of Tibet, have given them economic gain, have given and are saying, this is what we can offer. All that you were offered, well, from their point of view, was religious nonsense.
Yeah.
They wouldn't say it that way, but that we can give you economic growth and development. And apparently to some degree that has happened in Lhasa because they put a lot of money in there. And notice that in 1959, when the Dalai Lama finally left, it was largely internal groups backed by the communist government, no doubt, that put the final pressure on the Dalai Lama to leave. So if you ask someone who is a supporter of the Chinese government, the story will be different. But that, as a historian, that doesn't surprise me. There are always different perspectives. In any case, so they were promised a better life. The peasants, that's what they were promised by the Chinese government. A better life materially, let me put it that way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okie doke.
Just a comment, Bill.
Yeah.
I remember when we first went to hear the Dalai Lama, he was asked a question: if there was a conflict in your Buddhist writings with science, which would you choose? And I was interested to hear him say science.
Yeah.
I would choose the science. And then when I later heard him in Santa Barbara, it was very advanced scientific understanding of certain principles. So apparently he's really steeped in science.
And what Tibetan Buddhism has attempted to do is make a science of the mind. In other words, science can be looked at as understanding the external material world, physics, etc. And he agrees with that. He does, but it can also be used to examine the mind, the way the mind works. And he says this is scientific. And to some degree, if you've read what meditation does and attempts to do, it can be brought under that notion of scientific. What's interesting, and this is the part that Western thought does not get, was that element of the bone religion that I talked about, the spirits and the rituals that go with that, because that would be seen probably to be kind of out there. But even if you look at that, as I mentioned earlier, really what it's an attempt to do is to take your demons and rather than repress them, bring them into the discussion by taming them. In other words, if you have anger, if you're really angry, you don't want to repress that and say, I'm not angry, because that will just come back later. You have to take that anger, work with it, see its foundation, see why it's there, and then incorporate it into your meditation. If you meditate on the anger, you will reduce its impact, rather than just saying, I'm not angry, where deep down you really are. So I find that very interesting. Even bringing in those bone spirits, it's an attempt to scientifically, if you want to use that term, bring these elements into your psyche without repressing. We know that repression doesn't work. Whenever I hear Barry Curzon talk, and I've been to a number of his talks, he will say, we're not talking about repression. To repress something doesn't get rid of it, or it doesn't bring it into the fold. All it does is bury it and make it more poisonous.
Who finances the lifestyle now of the Dalai Lama?
Mainly his followers
Followers?
throughout the world. Richard Gere. If Richard Gere is a big follower of the Dalai Lama. A number of celebrities have caught on, but essentially the exiled Tibetan community, which exists in northern India around Dharamsala.
This is Jerry. Does the Dalai Lama require a very strong security force like our president does?
You better believe it.
Better believe it. Okay,
Yeah.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. Wherever he goes, he's got intense security. When we went to see him at Century City, he came in the back door and out the back door into a limousine. It's just like the president's.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were protests, interestingly enough, by Chinese around the event, saying that he's really a fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks for attending this series. The Education Committee is having a meeting in a couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll come up with some additional classes, both in person and Zoom. And we definitely appreciate your your support. Next Wednesday, I will be speaking at the noontime luncheon. My experiences largely with the orphanage in Nepal, with some hope to maybe get some support for those kids. So
I'd love to have a class on Martin Luther sometime in the future.
Martin Luther or Martin Luther King? Martin Luther?
Martin Luther.
Yeah. Maybe on the Reformation in general. That would be, yeah.
Yeah, the Reformation. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. Adios, everyone.
Adios.
Bye, everyone. Have a
Shanti,
good
Shanti
week.
Om, as they say. Peace, peace. Bye-bye.